Good evening. I'm Holly Clayson, a emerita professor in the art history department, and I'm here to welcome you to tonight's part 2 of the mini course begun last week. You, of course, know it is the end of monastery libraries in Europe. I won't again share an extended introduction because you know that our presenter, Jeff Barrett, is both a distinguished librarian and a distinguished historian of libraries. Just a couple more things I want to mention to you before we welcome Jeff to the podium. Many of you will have seen his photograph in today's issue of the Evanston Roundtable. Yes, it was a group photo, but there he was in the back row, plain as can be. Anyway, he was there because he was one of the recipients of a Cultural Heritage Award from the Evanston Preservation Commission, and he received it from the hand of Daniel Biss. Yes, anyway. This award recognized the library's very honorable and distinguished newspaper memory project. I'm sure a lot of you have heard about that. They've now completed the digitization of 12 Evanston newspapers all the way back to 1872. An important contribution to local history. And the last item, and this is going to seem, well, this is going to seem self-important. I should put a bag over my head, but anyway, it falls to me to announce the dates for the next NEO mini course. They have been set, and they're a little bit, well, you'll see, they're a little bit odd because it's now one Wednesday and one Thursday in January. So the dates will be Wednesday, the 14th and Thursday, the 22nd. And as is the case always, it will be a hybrid event. The title of the course is New Perspectives on French Impressionism. And the teacher of the course is yours truly. In many ways, maybe some of you know about this. In many ways, I guess it'll be a kind of a continuation of a course, a mini course I taught in the winter of 2022 when we were all at home cowering in front of our screens, which also was a course that thematized issues, perspectives on French Impressionism. And in that course, I had the virtual pleasure of meeting 180 participants. So I hope maybe a few of them might want to come back. Anyway, as they say, without further ado, it's my pleasure and my honor to welcome Jeff to the podium. Thank you.
Is better? Okay, great. So last week, under the very theatrical heading, Splendor and Catastrophe Before 1800, we talked about the support for monasticism fading during the Enlightenment, and even the very pious Habsburg Empire dismantling a good percentage of its over 2,000 monasteries. And we ended with a book auction in a small Austrian town in 1787. So this time, here we go, we're going to be focusing on Bavaria, which along with Austria has always been the center of my research. And I had promised that if we had enough time at the end, I would talk about my most recent project, which is on Carl Sagan and Eric Kandel, a Nobel Prize winning paleophysiologist. But I've decided that topic is too big, too important, and too complex, and above all, too distracting from our actual topic. And so I've talked with Susan and some others about doing a program specifically on the role of libraries in human evolution sometime probably near the end of winter. And I believe it's worth it. It's been very well published. And so we're not going to have that. Instead, another distraction, I suppose, I brought a couple of books that I will introduce to you. They are all in German, which is to say that you can't really study this topic without a language other than English. French works fine. German is extremely important because we're looking not only at Germany, but the entire Habsburg Empire. But some of these books are very beautiful, and I'll be happy to introduce them to you later. So remember, we finished last time with that auction in Ardagger in 1787. Well, just 2 years later, in 1789, everything shifted drastically. I guess you could call it a paradigm shift, but that sounds too intellectual. This is a complete revolution, a word that was never applied to an event in European history until this one. It was a complete rupture with the past, even more so than what had happened in Germany in the 1500s and in England under Henry VIII. Revolutio is a Latin word. We have revolution, and it means a conscious break with what went before. It was not or no longer a reformatio or a renovatio, which is a return to an idealized past. You'll remember in Austria, Joseph actually wanted to kind of clean up the church. He didn't want to do away with it. So in France, monasteries were not only closed, like here in Strasbourg, the lower frame, but they were destroyed, and the monks were often slaughtered. The books and archives surviving the destruction were sent to so-called dépôts littéraires, literary depots, to be rededicated, it was said, to the welfare of the people. Many of the most valuable books, if they were recognized in time, were sent to what had been the Royal Library, was now the National Library. Others were destroyed. The numbers are pretty shocking. Of the presumed 8 million books in monasteries and in aristocratic collections across France, maybe 2 million made it to the National Library. Others were destroyed or lost, or just discarded or left on the shelves to rot over the next decades. But 2 million is still a huge number. And it caused a crisis of organization which persisted into the middle of the century, the middle of the 1800s. This man is Belgian, so his name is either Joseph van Praet or Joseph Dupré. And his nickname was Le Catalogue Vivant, the living catalog. He knew where everything was and what it was about. So whereas before in library history, you needed extraordinary memory powers, mnemonic powers, to know the histories, to know the contents of clay tablets or scrolls. Now it was impossible not only to know what was in the books, but what the books were about. The bibliographic information was too vast for any human being to have in their minds, regardless how impressed they were with their own powers of memory. Many librarians of that era simply refused to believe that a disciplined mind could not master the glut. And we will shortly see what happened to them, the John Henrys of library management. The old ways were collapsing under the weight of so many books. So we remember Martin Luther calling the books of the monks asses' dung. Who could forget that? Well, during the French Revolution, believe it or not, a further radicalization of attitudes would take place. Typical of this inflamed attitude was that of this gentleman, François Urbain Domergue, a grammarian by profession, but during the Revolution, a commissioner of the so-called Bureau de Bibliographie, the agency charged with channeling the enormous flow of books from the ecclesiastical and aristocratic collections to Paris, and administering the dépôt littéraire. Domergue called many or most monastery books not just stupid or wrong or nonsense, which is what Luther did. He called them counter-revolutionaries hiding in the libraries of France. So a time-honored solution to this problem would have been simply to destroy them and be done with it. But instead, Domergue advocated something far more devious, namely that the evil contained in these books be sent abroad. Oh, that's in French. Let me push the button here. There. It's actually two slides overlaying each other. So he wrote, "Let us send to the camps of our enemies the poison of our books on theology, mysticism, monarchism, feudalism, and oppressive legislation. While our Republican armies bring their own form of destruction to our enemies, let us finish the job by bringing into their minds, through these books, vertigo and delirium." Whoa, sounds like Governor DeSantis. Directing the poison of these books into the enemy camp would at once purge France of error and drive counter-revolutionary Europe into fevered insanity, said Domergue. But probably more than half of these books were in Latin, Greek, or Hebrew. I think Domergue and his zeal may have overlooked. So France and this hostility to the books of the old order was the model for library confiscations in much of the rest of Europe. And indeed, this was discussed at the Oxford Conference in 2012 that I mentioned earlier. But cowardly perhaps, I would like to leave France now and leave the subject, the vast subject of the revolutionary destruction of French monastic culture and libraries to others who perhaps have better French than I do and more time. So this man, turning to Bavaria, is Munich court librarian Baron Johann Christoph von Aretin. And he was one of the most fascinating and controversial figures of 19th century Bavarian intellectual history. He was a well-published historian. He was a member of the academies in both Munich and Göttingen, the scientific academies that were being founded across Europe in the actually late 17th and then in the 18th centuries. He was an aggressive anti-Austrian and anti-Prussian pamphleteer, a notorious womanizer, I should add, and possessed of a frightful temper. Aretin had already made a name for himself as a firebrand and sympathizer both of the French Revolution and the radical Illuminati, which were founded, by the way, in Ingolstadt, not far from Munich. His biographer and great-grandnephew, Erwin von Aretin, describes him as one of the best hated men of intellectual Munich. His life abounded with intrigue and scandal. Even his transfer in 1811 away from Munich to a judgeship in deeply provincial Neuburg on the Danube was shrouded in allegations concerning a stabbing incident in which one of his many northern German enemies, the pedagogue and classicist Friedrich Tirsch, was the victim. He was also, at least in his own opinion, possessed of extraordinary powers of memory, which gave him great credibility as a librarian in this age and made him, in his mind again, on a level with Van Praet in Paris. He even wrote a book, which you can see here, on the subject of mnemonics or memory science in 1804. A further interesting twist in his character and the cornerstone of the career we will now be examining more closely is that Aretine was, as his biographer put it, an almost fanatical lover of books. One might even say a bibliomaniac. That's a valuable gift when you're confiscating libraries. Hot tempers and an affection for books are a rare pairing, perhaps today, but it is documentably rampant, this connection. Passion for books. It was documentably rampant in France and elsewhere in Europe during the early 19th century. And we're going to see how this comes into play now. So the Bavarian armies had been allied with Austria, and the Austrians and the Bavarians were defeated at the Battle of Hohenlinden outside Munich in December of 1800, and the French occupied the entire country. Aretine, interestingly, was appointed liaison officer to the French General Marshal Ney, stationed in Mühldorf, 50 miles east of Munich. And as revealed by their correspondence, a calm, even friendly relationship developed between them. As it turns out, Ney, too, was a notorious book lover, as were many of the Napoleonic generals, names like Neveu, Delmas, Yobat, Lecourbe, Thomas, and Villas. Their visits were feared by the librarians all across Europe, from Madrid to Vienna, because they could take whatever they wanted to, and did. Congress of Vienna fixed that. That was quite a while later. So it was perhaps, and I was not able to find definitive proof of this, but it was perhaps with Ney's patronage that Aretine traveled to Paris for 3 months in 1801 to visit the Bibliothèque Nationale to study its organization and structure. Just as surely as he was struck by the sheer mass and magnitude of book resources which had flowed to Paris from monastic libraries throughout France, Aretine was to become a disciple of the French revolutionary ideal for libraries, namely la mise à la disposition de la nation, putting these libraries at the disposition of the nation. Usefulness to the public was an entirely new virtue for libraries after that time. But it was the French Revolution that made it clear that libraries are there to serve the people. So in a memo dated February 6th of 1802, upon returning from Paris, Aretine wrote to his superiors in the Bavarian government the following: "It would be extremely important to have experts inspect these libraries," meaning the libraries of the monasteries, "and to have lists prepared of the most notable books, so that the literary treasures often to be found there do not fall into the hands of the outside speculators who are already lying greedily in wait for them, and which in this unworthy manner would be lost, both to the detriment and to the disgrace of the fatherland." You know, compare this to Thomas Cromwell. I mean, a great show on TV, but Cromwell and Henry VIII were in no way interested in the books. So Aretine's petition to the government was answered and fulfilled beyond his wildest dreams. Within weeks of it being written, Aretine was entrusted with the confiscation of valuable books for the court library from the hundreds of monasteries in Bavaria, and additionally with the coordination of confiscations for the new university library in Landshut, as well as for the higher schools and public libraries across Bavaria. He was entrusted also with the disposal of the rest. You can see what happened to the Franciscan library in Munich. There's the before and after. His goal, having been taught this in France, in Paris, was to end the monopoly of monasteries over the library resources of the land, without, however, and this was a Bavarian touch, the blood that there had been in France. Not that he was averse to using force. Across the board, he was just as haughty and rigorous and leathery and determined as many of his French counterparts were. And in fact, he was to become, in the words of a contemporary, the hard-hearted persecutor of the monks. So listen to this. Monks who were turned out of their monasteries were given a choice. They could return to secular life, they could become village priests, or they could be moved to one of the several central monasteries, as they were called, that the Bavarian state let survive for the incorrigible monks who were not willing to accept any kind of change. These central monasteries were called popularly Aussterbeklöster, monasteries to die out in, which kind of summarized what they were. You know, they would be basically put there, no real mission. They from all different kinds of religious orders, and they would then die and everyone could move on. So all of the other glorious monasteries, and I'm going to be showing you some pictures of them in a moment, were turned into army barracks, hospitals, nursing homes, schools, or occasionally were purchased by local aristocrats. This is what they often today still are. As a matter of fact, Sankt Emmeram, perhaps the most noble monastery of them all, a Reichsabtei, an imperial abbey in Regensburg, was sold cheaply to the family of Thurn und Taxis. You might know that all of you read People magazine, right? And it has been in their hands ever since. They turned it into their home. Their libraries were transported to Munich or Augsburg. They were sold off, or they were left on the shelves, sometimes for decades. So Augustin refused to see any tragedy in the destruction of the ancient abbeys. In fact, he described his expeditions across Bavaria, seizing the bibliographic assets of these abbeys, as what he called a literary business trip, with the goal of freeing up the library resources of the land from the deadly grip of the Mordmain, as it's called in English, Tote Hand, the dead hand, as it's called in German. So in February 1803, the Bavarian government decided to secularize not only the monasteries of the mendicant orders like the Franciscans, but also those belonging to the so-called prelate orders, until then privileged and protected members of the Bavarian estates. So one of his first visits was to the Premonstratensian order, their monastery in Schäftlarn, which is about 20 kilometers south of Munich. And he wrote in his diary the following: "Yesterday and today are separated by a chasm of 1,000 years. Today, the gigantic step over this chasm has been ventured. Today begins a new era of Bavarian history, important like none other which can be found. From now on, the moral, intellectual, and physical culture of this land will be entirely transformed. In 1,000 years," he writes, "the consequences of this step will still be felt. Historians of philosophy will speak of the dissolution of the monasteries just as we now look upon the lifting of the right to private warfare." That happened in 1495. "They will mark the beginning of a new age and will approach the ruins of the abbeys with the same mixed feelings with which we now contemplate the ruins of the castles of the old robber barons." So This is the attitude of a revolutionary, of course. He's not saying, you know, the monasteries have wandered off the path of the true faith. They've become indolent. No, the monasteries themselves were wrong and needed to be abolished. This too, I think he learned in France. So after Schäftlarn, Aretine continued to travel from monastery to monastery, ultimately visiting a large percentage of the roughly 200 monasteries of the land, demanding that the most desirable books and manuscripts, which he would select, be shipped to Munich. So look at this. Within a few weeks, he reached the village of Boyon in the foothills of the Alps. And there the monastery of Benedict Boyon, after Tegernsee, where the monks were caught hiding books under their beds, his second truly major prize. Benedict Boyon was founded in 1740 by the English monk Saint Boniface. It possessed an extremely important scriptorium of its own in the Middle Ages, and its library was among the most important in German-speaking Europe. So you can see here there's a blue box around the freestanding library building that was erected between 1722 and 1724 to protect books and archives in the event of a fire in the main building, which usually, of course, started in the kitchen. And of course, scriptoria for many, many centuries were put above the kitchen so that the heat would allow the monks to be able to write. I mean, it's difficult to make these beautiful initials and letters if your hands are frozen. So soon after Aretine arrived in April 1803, he estimated that Benedict's Boyon library possessed about 20,000 volumes. Of these, he chose 7,000 manuscripts, printed books, and crucially, music scores for the Munich Court Library and the other libraries of the state. Munich, the state library today, has the most extraordinary collection of medieval and Renaissance Munich music in Europe. This is where that came from. So he sent the most valuable books by land, just for the safety of it. And then the rest well-packed and sealed down the Isar River to Munich. There is a book about the dissolution of Benedict Boyon, and the author has done extraordinary research. He writes that wooden boxes had to be assembled in all haste, of course, and that the sawmill in Benedict Boyon spent days cutting boards for them. Here, as in Austria, much was lost. One author describes in lurid detail how the crates broke open, spilling their contents in the mud. And these, by the way, were the most valuable books, the 7,000 that Aretine had selected. 12,000 or more books stayed behind in the library, and they stayed there for the next 35 years, a period in which the Bavarian army had turned this monastery into their barracks. And then they were disposed of by auction. This is not atypical. So take a look at this. This is Benedict Boyon today. Not at all destroyed. So it had been occupied by the Bavarian army. Today it is once again a monastery, and it has been since 1930, when it was purchased by the Salesians of Don Bosco. It is now home to the Salesians Philosophical Theological University, and its library has 130,000 volumes, virtually none of which were in their original collection. I've been there. It's a modern research library. They don't specialize in manuscripts or anything else. They're training priests and theologians. So one of the trophies Aretine sent back to Munich from Benedict Boyon, you see here. It was the manuscript of the Carmina Burana, a collection of 318 mostly quite ribald songs in mixed Latin and German. This is called macaronic, a line of Old High German, a line of Latin, Old High German, Latin. And you probably know that it was set to music by the German composer Karl Orff in 1937, and it's being performed tomorrow by the choir, the chorus of the Lyric Opera. I really wanted to go, but $130 was the cheapest seat. And I've got really nice recordings at home. So yeah, so it should be said that Aretin did not send the manuscript back, not for perhaps 2 months. He kept it with him because he was enjoying it so much. And he quoted from it liberally and with gusto in his diary and in letters to friends. Here's another aside. So the Carmina Burana were published about 40 years after their discovery by another Munich librarian named J.A. Schmeller, who gave them their not entirely accurate name, Carmina Burana, which means Songs of Beuron. In fact, these songs, and medieval language specialists have determined that they are written in the dialect of South Tyrol, which has a sizable German population. Then it was mainly German. Today, they only speak German in the mountains. Down below, it's all Italian. So they've been traced. Benedict Boyan must have gotten the manuscript in some other way. There are numerous possibilities, but we don't know. But okay, I want you just to take a look at this again. You see the illustration? This is for a song entitled, unmistakably, Flower, Pluck My Flower. No explanation will be provided. He also, okay, Schmeller initiated the very dubious tradition of writing the two lovers from the horizontal to the vertical. And you can see that a lily is being passed from her to him. Okay, and now it looks just like a friendly passing of a flower, not what it was originally intended to mean. So in the same purifying spirit, and I'm sorry, it's difficult to see what's going on here, but in one of the poems, I Was Such a Beautiful Child, written in alternating German and Latin, which is a very lewd account of a seduction. Oh, we should probably call it what it was, a rape by a young nobleman, as told from the girl's perspective. I wanted to read one of the strophes. It's hard to see from here, but I'm going to try it. I'm going to back up a bit. And I had to learn Middle High German at the University of Munich. So I'm your expert to as good as you're going to get, unless Professor Müller would like to do this. So, greif mir an das wiese Gewand, Walde in des Center, erfwurte mich bi der Hand, multum violenter. He grabbed me on my white dress, white also symbolic, very indecently, and he took me by the hand with much violence. Anyway, that's macaronic. First one, then the other. And not all of the poems of the Carmina Burana are macaronic. A lot of them are just pure German or pure Latin, but it's most fun to see the alternation. That's a lot of fun. I still haven't figured out Yankee Doodle. Put a feather in his cap and called it macaroni. It wasn't pasta, and it wasn't alternating languages. So you can attend my mini course on revolutionary lyrics in 5 years. So who could have written these sophisticated but clearly very off-color songs and verse? Well, everything points to a 12th and 13th century class of wandering scholar poets and itinerant monks and clerics known across Western Europe as Goliards. Their poems mocked the church and its corruption while praising the earthly delights of eating, drinking, loving, gambling, self-pity, and flattery. In other words, all different forms of debauchery. They were often the second or third sons of families. You know, in the Middle Ages, we had primogeniture, and the firstborn would inherit everything. The second sons had to either go into the army or go to a monastery. And many of them actually went to monasteries and received a very good education. And this would explain much of the erudition reflected in this verse. So Goliardic poems, such as those of the Carmina Burana, are rare instances of a secular music and literature tradition in the Middle Ages that was not quashed by the church, which was responsible for handing down. I mean, we talked about this. This was found in a monastic library and was very blasphemic. And, you know, how did it survive? Good question. But I suspect a lot of the monks had a lot of fun with it. So they were written for a well-educated audience. The composers themselves must have been very well educated. Complex poetic devices, internal rhyme and rhythm, intricate wordplay. So a real work of art found quite by accident and not destroyed, which is unfortunately existed to today if it had not been destroyed. So I know I'm getting off track here, but the Carmina Burana are typical of the extraordinary cultural riches which came to light in the weeks and indeed the decades after the confiscation of monastic libraries. So as long as we're off the track here, let's stay there for a moment and even get into the weeds a bit further, because Goliardism isn't dead. It is apparently alive and well, certainly in parts of Italy. I read a report that about 10 years ago, in fact, 64 young people in Emilia-Romagna between the ages of 20 and 35 were arrested for showing contempt to the church because they were staging fake wedding ceremonies, fake baptisms, and these events involved fake parodies of church vestments, pieces of Italian salami used as the host for communion, and the pièce de résistance, a toilet brush in place of the aspergillum, which is the thing that sprays holy water. The priest who led the rites would arrive on the back of a pickup truck wearing a set of horns and dispensing holy water using that toilet brush. Okay, enough of this blasphemy. Let's get back to 1803. So as is clear from his journal and the anecdotes, such as those surrounding the Carmina Burana, Baron von Arettin really loved his job. And the job his biographer described as extracting the brains from the corpses of the monasteries, which is a rather drastic way of telling that. In fact, the monasteries in Bavaria and in Austria were probably doing better in the 18th century than at any point in their history. So they weren't corpses. Instead, they were flourishing like rarely before in the past. So anyway, look at these monasteries. Between 1802 and 1810, over 200 monasteries were suppressed across Bavaria, including several that even then dated back 1,000 years. Tegernsee, Benedikt Beuern, Weltenburg. I'm showing pictures of them all here. These are contemporary photographs. So they were not destroyed, as in England and in other countries. Instead, they were repurposed, mise à la disposition de la nation. They were converted to important secular uses, which is why we refer it to secularization rather than demolition. So I mentioned before Sankt Emmeram. Many of these actually had representatives in the Parliament of Bavaria, some even in the imperial parliament, like Sankt Emmeram. In other words, they were political entities of the highest order, and yet, keeping in mind that the Holy Roman Empire was dissolved in 1806 on the order of Napoleon, all of these monasteries had lost their protection and they were dissolved by 1810. None were destroyed. Some were repurposed beyond recognition. But you can see, if you ever go to Germany, Neuschwanstein, if you must, but these monasteries are extraordinarily interesting places to visit. So the quantities of books which flooded out of these institutions was staggering even by today's standards. We mentioned 2 million books arriving in Paris. Well, in Bavaria, which is a much smaller political entity, the number was about 200,000, maybe 1/6 the total of all monastic books. The others found other purposes. We will talk about those in a minute. So this was an extraordinary flood of books to Munich. And in a couple of years, it was described as second only to the National Library in Paris as the most outstanding library in Europe. I beg to differ. These were nothing but piles of books at that point. And shelves could be built, but you know, a library, the quality of a library is not determined by the quantity of its books, but by its level of organization. But Antonio Panizzi, probably the most famous librarian in Europe at the time, put it right after Paris as the most important library in Europe. So the way that the confiscations took place is only imaginable against the background of the French Revolution. So here, looking at the confiscations at ground level reveals much about the policies and attitudes in play during this piece of history and the influence of the French Revolution, suggesting not the uselessness of monastery books, but their toxicity. This is something that the French taught us. So in the first months of confiscation across Bavaria, books not selected by the libraries of the state or school libraries, they were often bought up cheap by peddlers who were fitted out even with licenses issued by the Bavarian government. They went door to door selling these books. But they were poisonous. And the Bavarian state, once they learned of this, they decided that has to be stopped. So they were stopped by order of the Bavarian General Director for Schools and Studies. So you can see what then happened in a number of reports by government agents, one of whom is named Brüninger, and he was responsible for disposing of the books from monasteries near Dorfen in Upper Bavaria, which you see in this contemporary image. And by the way, up above the town, it turns out that's not a monastery. That's a pilgrimage church. And the dormitories are not for monks. They're for priests who lead the multitudes. And you can see that there's a structure leading up there. That's called Stations of the Cross. And you can see this all over Europe. You know, you have to walk up to the pilgrimage church. But in any case, Dorfen was where the books of the monasteries surrounding Dorfen were collected and, well, dealt with. Before being sold, we read in this report from September 4th, 1803, the cover, title page, and index of each book was carefully detached. The books were then torn into 20 to 30 pieces, which were thrown individually into different piles scattered across the room, making them impossible to reconstitute. In other words, they created waste paper. Bruninger says 200 pounds per session, 200 weight of waste paper. But you have to think on this. Religious books from monastery libraries had to be torn up to be detoxified. Otherwise, even, small chapters could poison the innocent people. Bruninger concluded one report with the remark that he had kept some of the most remarkable outgrowths, Auswüchse, of these libraries for future historical research as a vivid document of the past monk's age. But now back to Munich, where, as in Paris, the flood of books led to a chaos of almost biblical proportions. Aretine actually lost his job as chief librarian, not because of some miscellaneous scandalous behavior, but because he was at a complete loss to devise a, quote, system, unquote, for organizing the books on shelves in the old Baroque sense. Remember, I think we talked about this a little last time, in the Baroque library, the order of books must be visible. There was a place for every book, and every book had its place. And remember, we pointed out that gaps were not tolerated. They were filled by substitute books made of wood, so that God was everywhere and the devil could be nowhere. So Aretine was gone. He went off to Neuburg an der Donau, a cute little town, but no road, certainly no Autobahn goes to Neuburg. So Aretine's successor was Julius Hamburger, a northerner, who also attempted to fit books one by one into the traditional system of the Baroque library. 200,000 books, that's a lot of book. And so the Baroque library would be readable by any scholar worthy of the name. They had no idea what to do otherwise. Catalogs frequently did not exist in Baroque libraries, or they were just a mirror of what you saw on the shelves. So he stayed around for a while. By the end of 1810, he had managed to catalog 45,000 books. Well, at this pace, it would have taken 18 more years to have a functioning library. And it was said that he went mad. I think that's probably what we today would call a nervous breakdown. And he was replaced in 1811 by Franz von Krenner, a recognized scholar and also the owner of the largest collection of erotica in Germany. Well, book collectors don't necessarily make good librarians. And I mean, I'm sorry, I'm a book collector. You can come to your own conclusions about that. And he didn't last long, 8 months. His successor was the bookseller and publisher Josef Scherer, by the way, the man who published von Aretine's book about memory science. And he was in office for 10 years, despite accomplishing little. Early on the morning of April 4th, 1826, out of a sense of complete personal and professional failure, he attempted to drown himself in Munich's English Garden. He was rescued by a passerby, but several months later, police were called to remove him, completely insane in the words of a colleague, from his office, and he ended up in Munich's General Hospital. Fans of Argentinian writer Jorge Luis Borges will recognize this from the story of the Library of Babel, where the librarians all went mad and would throw themselves off the balconies and then fall forever because the library was that huge. So anyway, the image on the slide you see here is an artist rendering of Boghus's Library of Babel. And this is, at least philosophically seen, the way the Munich book collection, it was no longer a library, looked. So ultimately, the utter chaos, the totally unprecedented situation forced the caretakers of these new, literally unimaginable resources, not only to build a new monumental edifice to house them, what you see here, and this is a contemporary photograph. I mean, it was right across from the university where I studied, and it's an incredible library. So they built that. It now houses 12 million volumes, but also to abandon the traditional idea of the library as a kind of open book, as one that you could grasp when you walk in. Remember the impression of our English historian as he walked into Glastonbury, and he was stupefied by the library that he saw. No library looks that way today. So also the entire ideal of the librarian as infinitely memorious, that had to be abandoned as well. And it was replaced by an abstract science of information organization held together and made usable by a system of interlocking, cross-referencing library catalogs. So as you can gather, this becomes fairly technical very quickly. But in the greatest of ironies, the man who solved the crisis of this enormous pile of books was an apostate Benedictine monk from a dissolved monastery. His name is Martin Schrettinger. He is now celebrated as a national hero, not just among Bavarian librarians, but among Bavarian scholars more generally. He had been exposed in his monastery of Weißenohe to the work of Emmanuel, who always said that, you know, the essence of something is not visible to the human eye. It is complex and internal and must be understood by what we would today call science. So I received a grant to go read his diaries in Munich, and all during the 1790s, he was fighting with his abbot about Immanuel Kant. And new books would arrive for Schrettinger, and the abbot would find out about it and force him to send them back. And so he figured out how to avoid the abbot. And when the monasteries were being dissolved, he was out of there. And but he was a brilliant library organizer. And the book that you see in the middle is his attempt to create a textbook for library science. He called it library science. No one had ever called it library science before. It was always called Bibliothekskunde, librarianship, or Bibliotheksökonomie, library economics. So I own a modern reprint edition and am very proud of that fact. This book, by the way, I photographed the title page from Northwestern's special collections. Northwestern has one of 5 copies in the United States, which, you know, bravo. So what made his library science so revolutionary? For one, he disqualified the memory of the librarian as having anything to do with library organization. Wow. He wrote, "The memory of the librarian is not an inherent part of any library deserving of the name. When one librarian replaces another, it must not be that the library becomes unusable and therefore no longer a library." And he got this idea by reading Kant, that order in a library is not in the memory of the librarian, It's in the order, the invisible order of catalogs that link books to each other. He also invented the term intertextuality, which is, I mean, very important for modern literature studies. So Schrödinger also rejected the notion that books, like animals and plants, could be put into a visible Linnaean taxonomy. Keep in mind that the Baroque library was basically linear. Shelf, shelf, shelf. Books were not related to one another diagonally, like in Chutes and Ladders. It was basically one long line of books. And the Swedish zoologist Linnaeus created the idea of a taxonomy of all living things, and it made sense. But Schrödinger said that books have different identities depending on the perspective and the information needs of individual users. I mean, I'm a librarian, and I just find that absolutely brilliant. Schrödinger, therefore, also rejected all of the display and representational aspects of the library, things that unfortunately make Baroque libraries so beautiful. He called them irrelevant and a distraction. Did he have a sense of humor or any aesthetic sense? I don't know. So the utility of the library in service to its users should be all that matters, he wrote. So Schrödinger, a national hero in Bavaria, a librarian as a national hero, you doubt it? Well, he celebrated his 250th birthday recently. So just look at this site created to celebrate that birthday. It's in English on Google Arts and Culture, which is pretty amazing. This is a portrait of him. And no, not ready for that. I wanted to show a video of this because he actually greets you in Franconian dialect. In German, of course. But the rest of this site is all in English, and it's beautifully done. So I'm not even going to try to get it to play. You get the idea. So let me just say, as you probably already gathered, that Martin Schrödinger was, for me as a young librarian, a liberating figure. Remember what he said: a real library must function without the librarian as a human catalog. As a student and then as a practicing librarian, it drove me crazy when superiors would say, or a librarian in a library I wasn't familiar with, if you need something, ask me. The non plus ultra of the librarian as a know-it-all is this guy. I hope he shows up. If you've seen the movie The Name of the Rose, you'll know who he is. And actually, Umberto Eco wrote that novel because he was so furious at librarians across Italy. He said there are only two good libraries that he's ever been to. One was Yale University Library, and the other was the University of Toronto Library. But Jorge of Burgos is that figure there, represents typical Italian librarians in the mind of Umberto Eco. So for Schrödinger, and for me too, the role of the librarian has always been to empower users to help themselves. The library in its ideal state is a perfect tool. If you have a hammer, you don't need to get someone to put the head on the hammer every time you use it. The hammer is there, and it's a tool, and it works. It may require some training and explanation to use a library, and that's the librarian's actual role. But it should not be the librarian who provides or blocks access. I'm going to stop there. I'm going to be happy to show you some of these books, but why don't we take a few questions first? And I don't know, Susan, are we putting on cards or should we just pass the microphone along around? Yeah, okay. Where is the mic currently? Okay. So any questions from the multitude? Okay.
So when did the organization that we know today, Dewey Library, Dewey Decimal System, the Library of Congress system, when did all of that come into play? And was it an outgrowth of what you've been talking about, the utility of a library?
Yes and no. Dewey created a taxonomy, the Dewey Decimal System, for organizing all books. This is very Baroque. It's not modern at all. You want to know what Schrödinger did with books in the library and shelves. He put them on the shelves in order of acquisition, or the order that they came out of the boxes. This is called numerus currens. And these were closed stacks. And then he created extraordinary detailed catalogs. So he recorded the location of every book, and this location address was put on giant cards for individual subjects. And a book could appear on multiple cards so that people interested in hunting would find books on deers, and this is actually a true example, on the hunting card. It's actually much more diversified than that. But books on the kitchen, on cooking, would also have that same book on it, and it would be actually probably on 6 or 7 or 8 different cards. So the organization of the library was not visible to the user. And so what happened then with Dewey is that he put them in subject groupings, but he gave them subject headings, which allowed for a more diverse interpretation of what the book is about. So Munich, the State Library of Munich, is still like this. There are about, I think, 12 classes. In other words, the books are not completely randomly put on shelves. They're put in classes, but within a class, they are known by their address. And then the subject of the books is in catalogs. So using the catalog is extremely important. Perusing the shelves is not. Is that the best way to organize books? It was certainly revolutionary, and it did depart radically from the notion of library collections having any kind of visuality about them. You go to Munich now, and you don't see the books except in the huge reference library. And there's a funny story. I got a book for a project that I was working on, and it came, and I used it, and I put it back, and then I realized I'd forgotten a few things. So I came to pick the book up again after a couple of days, and my slip came back, and it was stamped Im Kriege zerstört, destroyed in the war, which I don't believe can be accurate. Okay, next question, please.
I'd like to ask a question about something that actually arose quite early in your remarks tonight. You said that once the French held sway and sort of took over Bavaria, librarians were terrified of the French.
Yeah.
And so I'm still trying to understand the sort of the shape of libraries in this world in these years. And I'm wondering, were there secular libraries at the time, or were the librarians who feared the French all engaged with monastic libraries? There weren't other species? Do you know what I'm trying to say?
I do. No, there were school libraries, public libraries existed.
Oh, they did?
Yeah, And, but that's not where the French generals would go. They would go to the monastery libraries. They would go to, you know, an aristocratic library, and they would say, show me your most beautiful books. And that was frequently the way the books left those individual collections.
So the actual, what word do I need? The actual sort of landscape of libraries in those years, you're for obvious and good reasons foregrounding monastic libraries, but there were other species
were.
of libraries.
There were city libraries too.
Oh, I see.
And a famous city library was Nuremberg. And, you know, it already had a notable bourgeoisie, but it was interesting, the library in Nuremberg, I've read a description of it. It was a mixture of books and animals and globes, and they would put these things roughly near where the book collections were. And so it was not a pure library at all. It was kind of a museum at the same time.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Do we have any questions from online yet?
Thank
Or
you.
we'll take a couple from the floor here.
Well, we did have a question that I think was already answered because it was very similar to our first question here.
Yes.
But I also wanted to share that we had a response in the chat to our question about Yankee Doodle and
Oh.
macaronis. So apparently macaroni refers to fashionable young men of the French Revolution, and the feather in the cap was a fashion choice. So
Thank
just
you.
wanted to share that.
Thank you,
That
internet
comes to us from
audience.
Jennifer Hance in the audience.
Okay.
Back in those days, what percent of people could read?
Oh, it began to improve in the late 18th century. I'd say before 1750, and there are plenty of books on this. We were talking about 15 or 20%, and it was tied very closely, first of all, to the growth of the bourgeoisie. You know, for business reasons, people had to be able to read. It was also tied to the increase in the number of books in the vernacular. And this is not just true in Germany and Austria, but across Europe. And so and then there was this explosion in the late 18th century. And, you know, maybe as many as 60 or 70% of the people could read somewhat.
Well, this is a personal question, and I asked him this when before he started his talk this evening, and he started to give me such an interesting answer. I said I thought he should tell his audience. So the question is this: how, Jeff, did you become so interested in monastic libraries?
What a surprising question.
Yes, I'm a plant.
Yeah. It came about, so my father died in 1976 when he and I were vacationing in Austria. And this is a very sad circumstance. And I was distraught and completely helpless for days after this happened. And the man who rescued me was the parish priest of the town where my father had died. And he took care of all of the bureaucracy. Sometimes he had to drive me into Linz, which was the nearest big town, to get this or that certificate. But I have no idea how I could have done it otherwise. It turns out that this man was not primarily a parish priest. He was a Cistercian monk. And from the nearby monastery of, we would say, Wilhering, they pronounce it Wilring, one syllable, I guess. And so I stayed there for about a week, and then I came back every couple of weeks because my father had been cremated and buried in the cemetery there as the only non-Catholic in that cemetery, and also the only one who had been cremated. And I found out later that Pater Petrus had gotten a special dispensation from the bishop in Linz to allow a Protestant, a cremated Protestant, to be buried in that cemetery. Well, so Pater Petrus, he took me occasionally with him across the river to his monastery and showed me around, and he introduced me to the archivist, Pater Rainer. And they were both absolutely delightful. And Rainer took me to the library, which was paltry. The archives were significant, and he showed me the papal bull from the 13th century, which established that the brothers of this monastery had pastoral care responsibilities all the way up to the Bohemian border. And so that's how Pater Petrus became the parish priest, which he actually was not. And his vestments were always monastic primarily. So the archivist, I said, pardon me, but this is a very small library for such a venerable institution. And he said, well, Joseph took them away, Emperor Joseph. And I said, could you explain? Well, anyway, that was the beginning of this. And so I basically was mentored by a Cistercian monk. And then he took me to other Cistercian abbeys across Austria, none of whom had significant libraries. All of them had been taken. And so when I went to graduate school at Berkeley, and I needed a library project, I decided my project would be to chart all of the monastic libraries in Austria. Dumb, impossible. I mean, they're just in Austria, not just in the rest of the Habsburg Empire, there are probably 800. But I created a database, and with each library, you could see like Melk still exists, or confiscated in 1784. And the Austrians never say they were secularized, because they weren't. They were rededicated to other religious purposes. That was what was the difference between Austria and France and then Bavaria. And so one thing led to another. And when I was a struggling librarian, I'm still struggling, a struggling librarian at Purdue, the Austrian history specialist and I got to know each other, and he invited me to speak at on a panel that he was organizing in Los Angeles, and this made me very nervous. And so anyway, in the end, I researched a lot, and so this is a preoccupation of mine now for 40 years. And I'm still researching this field, but I published an article in a Hungarian Catholic publication that was read by a medievalist at Oxford, and he is the one who invited me to this 2012 conference. And so that was kind of my breakout performance, kind of like, what's her name? Taylor Swift. So this hasn't gone to my head at all. So, but anyway, is that satisfactory answer? Okay. Any other questions? Okay. I am reachable at either of these two email addresses.